Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going deep into the world of autism spectrum disorder, exploring some fascinating research about how nature and technology might play a role. We've got two big meta-analyses to unpack, one on nature-based interventions and another on screen time, plus a really cool source that dives into the neurological side of things.
And the exciting thing about these meta-analyses is the sheer scale of data they're looking at. It's not just one study. It's like looking at the combined knowledge of a whole bunch of research, which gives us a much clearer picture.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The first study we dug into focused on nature-based interventions for children with autism spectrum disorder. Think the therapeutic horseback riding, outdoor recreation, that kind of thing. We're talking 24 studies with over 700 participants. That's a whole lot of data.
It is. And you know what's really interesting? The vast majority of these interventions, about 83%, revolved around horses. There seems to be something about equine-assisted activities that resonates with kids on the spectrum. But more broadly, this research suggests that nature-based interventions as a whole hold real promise. The meta-analysis showed improvements across the board, from sensory processing to social skills and even behavioral challenges.
The sensory aspect really jumped out at me. The study specifically mentioned that these interventions were successful in improving sustained attention, which is something many people with autism spectrum disorder struggle with.
And this is where things get really fascinating, especially when we consider how traditional therapies approach sensory issues. Those often take place in clinical settings, which can sometimes be overwhelming. Nature, on the other hand, offers this amazing dynamic environment that can be really beneficial. The research suggests it might even be more effective than traditional methods.
And the study also found that nature-based interventions help reduce hyperactivity and irritability, which again makes you think about traditional approaches like behavioral interventions and sensory-based therapies that often target those same issues. Nature seems to offer a whole new path.
It's exciting, but it's important to remember that this is still a relatively new area of research. While these initial findings are incredibly promising, we need more long-term studies to really understand the lasting impact of these interventions.
All right, let's move on to the elephant, or should I say the screen in the room. The second meta-analysis we looked at tackled the relationship between screen time and autism spectrum disorder. And this one was a real head-scratcher. Like the first one, it was massive. 46 studies, over 500,000 participants. It's like they analyzed data from an entire small country.
And initially, when you crunched all the numbers, it looked like there was a connection between increased screen time and a higher likelihood of autism spectrum disorder. But, and this is a big but, the researchers discovered something called publication bias was skewing the results.
Okay, before we get ahead of ourselves, can you explain what publication bias is?
Absolutely. Imagine you're only ever hearing one side of a story. That's kind of what publication bias is. Studies that find a link, any link, even a flimsy one, are more likely to get published. But studies that don't find a link often end up hidden away, never seeing the light of day. This creates an imbalance where the research we see doesn't necessarily reflect the whole picture.
So once the researchers adjusted for this publication bias, that initial link between general screen time and autism spectrum disorder basically disappeared, which I have to admit is a huge relief. But there's a twist, right?
There is. It turns out it's not as simple as saying screens are good or screens are bad. The type of screen use seems to make a big difference.
Right. That's the part that really blew my mind.
It's fascinating, right? When they compared general screen time with social media use, they found something completely unexpected. Remember how general screen time initially showed a potential link to autism spectrum disorder? Well, social media showed the opposite, a negative association.
It was like the data did a complete 180. So what does that mean?
It could mean that social media somehow protects against developing autism spectrum disorder, or it could simply be that people on the spectrum tend to use it less. We need more research to say for sure, but it highlights a crucial point for anyone listening. It's not about demonizing screens altogether. It's about understanding the nuances of how technology is being used by people with autism spectrum disorder.
Okay, so we've got these two big meta-analyses. One suggesting that nature could be a powerful tool for supporting kids with autism spectrum disorder, and the other showing us that the screen time issue is way more complicated than it seems. But remember that third source we mentioned, the one that dives into the actual neurological aspects of autism spectrum disorder. Let's talk about that.
Yes. This is where we can start connecting the dots between these studies and what's happening in the brain. This source focused on two key regions, the insula and the ACCMP-FC. Now, I know those sound like ingredients in a science experiment gone wrong, but stay with me. These regions are incredibly important because they play a huge role in things like sensory processing, social interaction, and emotional regulation, all areas that can be affected by autism spectrum disorder.
Okay, so those brain regions are like mission control for some pretty essential functions.
Mm,
And this is where it all starts to come together, right? Because that meta-analysis on nature-based interventions actually found some interesting things happening in the insula.
exactly. They found that children with autism spectrum disorder showed both decreased functional activity and increased gray matter volume in the insula. Now, I know that sounds a little confusing, like saying your car is running slower but also got bigger.
Yeah, it's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah. It's actually a clue. See, functional activity refers to how much the neurons in a specific area of the brain are firing, kind of like their activity level. Gray matter volume refers to the actual amount of gray matter, which is the brain tissue responsible for processing information. In the case of autism spectrum disorder, it seems the insula might be working differently and developing differently. This actually aligns with a theory called early brain overgrowth. This theory suggests that the brains of kids with autism spectrum disorder might go through a period of rapid and atypical growth early in childhood. So it's not just about the size of the brain, but how it's developing and how different regions are communicating with each other.
That's fascinating. It's like the insula is sending mixed signals. And that could be related to some of the sensory challenges we see in autism spectrum disorder. And if nature can potentially influence the structure and function of the insula, as that first study suggested, could screen time be doing something similar, especially in a region like the ACC-MPFC, which is so crucial for social development?
That's a great question, and it's something researchers are actively exploring. See, the ACCMPFC is involved in how we understand social cues, regulate our emotions in social situations, and develop social skills. It's like the social director of our brain. Studies have shown that this region plays a crucial role in how we navigate the social world. And some experts believe that excessive screen time, especially during those critical periods of early brain development, might disrupt how the ACCMPFC develops and functions.
So it's not about screens being inherently bad, but more about how they might be affecting the development of this crucial brain region, potentially contributing to the social difficulties some individuals with autism spectrum disorder experience.
Precisely. And to understand this a bit better, it's helpful to remember what we learned about the different types of screen time. While general screen use showed that initial and potentially misleading link to autism spectrum disorder, social media use actually showed the opposite. It's like there's something about social media that either offers a protective effect or is less appealing to those on the spectrum. More research will tell us for sure, but it reminds us that we can't just lump all screen time together. It's about understanding how different types of technology use might be impacting different parts of the brain, and how those impacts might be different for individuals with autism spectrum disorder.
It's like a giant puzzle, right? We have these seemingly separate pieces about nature, screens, and the brain. But when we put them together, a clearer picture starts to emerge. But how do we use these puzzle pieces? What does it all mean for parents, educators, therapists, anyone who wants to support kids with autism spectrum disorder?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while we don't have all the answers yet, I think these studies give us some really valuable clues.
It feels like we're on the verge of something really important here. If these different types of experiences can influence brain development, then creating supportive environments for kids with autism spectrum disorder could be even more crucial than we thought.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, how can we use this knowledge to better support children with autism spectrum disorder? It's not about shutting off all the screens or moving everyone to a farm, but it does make you think about striking a balance.
Right. It's about being mindful and intentional. Maybe we need to rethink how we design classrooms and playgrounds. Instead of just focusing on traditional structures, maybe we could incorporate more natural elements, creating spaces that stimulate the senses in a more natural way. Think outdoor classrooms, sensory gardens, even just more natural light and textures in indoor spaces.
Exactly. And we could explore ways to make technology work for these kids rather than being a potential detriment. We could focus on screen time that encourages interaction, creativity, and learning rather than just passive consumption. Think educational apps that teach social skills, virtual reality experiences that help kids navigate social situations, or even just video games that encourage collaboration and communication.
It's about using technology as a tool to support and engage, not as a replacement for real-world experiences and interactions. It's about finding that sweet spot where nature and technology can work together to create a truly supportive environment.
What's fascinating here is that we're really just scratching the surface. There's so much more to uncover about how nature, technology, and neurology all intersect in the context of autism spectrum disorder. But I think these studies give us a really great starting point. They challenge us to think differently about how we design our environments, how we use technology, and ultimately how we support individuals with autism spectrum disorder to thrive.
It's like we've been handed this incredible map, and now it's up to us to explore all the different pathways it reveals, and who knows what other fascinating discoveries await us along the way.
Exactly. The journey is just beginning.
Well, we've certainly given you a lot to digest today, but we hope this deep dive leaves you feeling inspired and empowered. There's so much potential to make a real difference. And the more we understand these complex interactions, the better equipped we'll be to create a world that truly supports the unique needs and strengths of all individuals with autism spectrum disorder.
Until next time, keep asking questions and keep diving deep.